Hello, and welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to use application insights to monitor your function apps. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and deploy an instance of application insights by going to our portal. And I'm going to be placing that into an existing resource group that I've already created. It's empty. And I'll go ahead and call it Cloud Developer Monitor. And I'll go ahead and put it in the East US region. So now for the purposes of this particular demo, I'm gonna just use the classic resource mode because I don't have a log analytics workspace deployed in here. And for this purpose, I don't actually need it. I'll go ahead and create and give it a second to actually finish deploying. It typically goes pretty quick. Now you can see it actually deployed within a few seconds. Now I'll go ahead and go back to my resource group, and it didn't have a chance to actually show up just yet, but it's gonna be here in a couple of seconds. There you go. And the next step is we're gonna go ahead and create a new function app, and I'll show you how to actually integrate it with this instance of appinsights. Now, there's a couple of things we want to do. We also, besides just creating a project, we want to actually deploy that piece of code showing how it actually will integrate with this appinsights instance. So before I create a project, let's go ahead and actually deploy a function app itself that we're going to actually deploy the code to. But I'll show you how to actually integrate it on your development machine, and then how you can actually get the same monitoring results from the hosted application in Azure. So let's go ahead and call this function app Cloud Developer Function Lin. To designate, it's going to be a Linux instance. And I'll go ahead and put it East US. Click Next. And I'm going to create a new storage account. Call it Cloud Developer Fun and STG. That's just going to be the storage account where the code is going to be hosted. And then I'll pick Linux as an operating system, and I'll choose the plan type as consumption. Click Next. And in this particular case, it gives you an option to automatically go ahead and link this particular function app itself to an instance of application insights. And since we already have one deployed, I'll go ahead and choose that one. Hit Next. Review and create. And I'll go ahead and hit create here. And while it's actually doing this, we're going to go to our Visual Studio instance here. And I'm going to go ahead and say create a new project. And I'll choose Azure Functions. Hit next. And I'll call it Function Monitor. And I'll put it in my D drive projects and functions folder. Hit create. Here I'll choose a trigger point to be an HTTP trigger, and since we're not really doing much with it, just kind of testing how to actually send events to application insights, I'm gonna omit having to specify a storage account, even a local one, because we don't need it for this purpose. I'll keep the authorization level, and I'll show you one of the things you want to be careful about when you're actually logging information to application insights. So let's go ahead and create it, and it's going to take a second to do that. And as it's actually doing it, you can see in the background that the deployment of the actual application, the actual function app itself finished. So if we go back here and let's navigate back to our resource group, you'll see that we have our app service plan, we have our application insights instance, we have our function app, and we have the storage account itself. So let's go ahead and start looking at what we need to do from a code perspective. So the first thing we want to make sure is let's go ahead and actually rename this function1 class to monitor test. You can call it whatever you need to actually call it for your business application. And here you can see that the default function that exists or comes along with a template is just called function1. So we'll just we'll rename it to say hello. So, and then here I'll just paste that as the name of a method, and since we're going to be just doing some testing, I'm going to get rid of the post. I'll just keep it as a get, and then I'll strip this code here of all of the other test logic, and I'll replace this message here with saying hello from our test function. Now let's see if we can actually run this and make sure that the code is executing properly. What you'll notice in here is it's going to give us a URL that we can test with. So let's go ahead and actually copy this URL, open up the browser, go into a new tab, and make sure that it's actually giving us what we want. And in this particular case, you can see that it's returning a function message itself. So now the other thing we want to take a look at here is how do we actually see the messages. We won't see anything right now, but one of the neat things about using application insights is they have this feature called live metrics. When you go to this blade, you should be able to actually see tracing information for your application, just like you would otherwise in a console application locally when you're executing your code. But this could actually be used for debugging your application, even when you're doing debugging locally of function app or a web app itself, and when it's actually running in Azure. So right now, since there's no integration, nothing is showing up here. So how do we actually get it to integrate with this instance? Now we already have a piece of code that's actually, we know that it's functional, but now we want to send telemetry into the actual application insights instance itself. So the way to do that is you just need to basically add a setting in your application file in your actual code, and be able to actually tell it which instance of appinsights. And you do that by setting the instrumentation key. So you can find that instrumentation key by going to your application insights instance, go into the overview blade, and then right here you can see the instrumentation key. So let's go ahead and copy it and go to our application itself, and then in the local settings JSON file, under the values, if you specify a new app setting here called appinsights instrumentation key, and you paste that value here. So just make sure you actually type this out correctly. So it's appinsights _ instrumentation key. Now, if you're not sure what that needs to be, another way to look at it is if you go to your function app, just like a web app, and you go to your configuration, what you'll see here is a set of application settings here. So, and the appinsights instrumentation key is located here as well. So what you can do is if you hit edit, you can copy and paste as the actual name and the actual value so you don't make mistakes. So let's just make sure we have the right value here. I'll go ahead and save it. And now I should be able to run this and actually start seeing telemetry flowing through into application insights. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Now, one thing to also note is sometimes depending on how you actually set up your application insights instance, some of the telemetry might not actually come through. I've noticed that. So the way to work around that is I had to actually restart the application itself. And sometimes you actually have to redeploy the instance of appinsights, which is kind of strange, but there are instances where you would need to do that. So you'll notice a couple of things now on the screen. So when I went to the live metrics view, now you can actually see some telemetry coming through. And a couple of things to note here. One is you'll see the servers list. Now the first two servers that you see have different names, long names. And these are the actual nodes or instances of application running in the Azure space. And the last one is called dev machine. That's actually my local development machine that I'm actually testing the code on. So as you can see, I'm actually running it right here on my local machine. Now, if I actually go ahead and move this out of the way and go back to my test tab, and I just hit refresh a couple of times, make sure that the code is actually executing, and go back here, you'll see all of these trace events that are beginning to come through. So we can actually now see that the requests are coming through from our machine. So that's pretty much as easy. That's how easy it is to actually get it integrated. Now, let's actually try to make it a little bit more useful. So one of the things that you actually gain from being able to use application insights like this is not just to be able to see the tracing information, but what if you want to actually go and see, for example, your failures. So if exceptions are being thrown, or performance information, so which methods are being called, that's useful. But another benefit is you can actually start tracking user sessions. You can actually start tracking users and events and many other things. Now, in order to do that, you have to actually do a little bit better of an integration with application insights. And there are specific method calls within the NuGet library of application insights that you can use to start doing page tracking events and other user type of events and things like that. So let me show you how to do that real quick. So we'll go ahead and stop it. And we're going to rewrite this code a little bit to start using dependency injection. And then also we're going to make it so that it actually brings in what's called the TelemetryClient from application insights. So how do we do that? So let's do this. Let's go ahead and right click on dependencies, click on manage NuGet packages, and then go to the browse section. And then let's go ahead and import two things. One is going to be the Azure Functions extension. And this NuGet package allows us to implement dependency injection. Go ahead and accept that. And then the other one is going to be the application insights itself. Now, the package that I'm going to be using here is going to be the Microsoft Application Insights ASP.NET Core. Depending on how you're trying to integrate your code, you might need to choose different NuGet packages. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to use this ASP.NET Core NuGet package. And go ahead and accept, close, and now we should be able to add our startup class, which is going to be used to set up dependency injection, and then we'll update this particular class to actually obtain our instance of TelemetryClient through the constructor. So how do we do that? So we'll go ahead and actually add a new class called startup. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell this application itself which method is which class is going to be used as a startup class. So you do that by doing by adding another attribute here called assembly, and using an attribute called function startup. And basically you tell it which class you want to start using for that startup class. And that's pretty much it. Now in here, what we want to do is we want to make this class inherit from function startup, and then we'll go ahead and implement the abstract class. And in order to actually make sure that the proper services are being added, all we have to do is just call builder services add application inside telemetry, and that's as simple as that. So let's go ahead and close that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a constructor here. And in the constructor, we're going to say every time this particular class gets instantiated, give me the instance of TelemetryClient, and we'll call it Telemetry, not Telemetry. And then I'll use this little IntelliSense to actually allow me to quickly create a couple of properties and a null check. And let's go ahead and move this. Remove the public attribute. So what this does basically is allow us let's actually fix the spelling here. And what this allows us to do now is we can replace all of these log messages to actually be able to call the telemetry class. So what we'll do is we'll replace the log.log information to telemetry trace, and it's going to be track trace, and this is actually going to send a tracing message into the live metrics view. and let's say triggered method say hello. So this method or this message is actually going to show up in a trace section of application insights. And then another thing I'll show you is basically how to track page type events, or in this particular case, as the user is invoking functions, you can actually see that which functions they're invoking. Now, really, the page tracking is more for application-based code. So if you have a web application where a user navigating from one page to another, that's really where you want to use it. But you can use that particular method within your functions or function apps themselves as well. So, and all you have to do is just say page, track page view, and then you can either just give it a string, basically the name of the method that we're invoking here, or you can actually create a new page view telemetry object. And then here it actually allows you to specify a few more pieces of detail that might be useful for your application. So what are we going to do here? So the first thing is we're going to want to give it a name, and we'll call it say hello to represent the actual method that's being called. The other thing that's going to be useful is we want to specify the URL itself. So, and this URL is a URI. And what we'll do is we have this HTTP request object that's coming in when this method is getting executed. And then we'll do is say rec get URI. And this is the piece that I wanted to make sure you're aware of. So when executing locally, you're not actually providing or logging your actual authentication key in order to actually invoke the function. Because if you remember, when we created the function app itself, we said we want function level authentication. Now, because when you deploy this to Azure and you try to actually test your application, you don't want to actually log your URL itself. That includes the actual API key, because that's going to be logging sensitive information and you want to avoid that. So what we're doing here is we're going to actually get the left portion of the URL, which is going to be just the path itself. So it's going to omit all of the query string parameters. That should be enough for us to be able to actually track details of which function is being executed. So, and the other piece is a timestamp. And we'll say datetime UTC now. And that's pretty much as simple as that. So, and another example that I'll show you is how to actually track exceptions themselves. So let's create a new function and just call it throw exception. And all we'll do here is just throw a new exception. Okay. Now what we'll want to do is we actually want to put in a try catch so that the application itself doesn't blow up. Okay. And we'll basically, in this particular case, not a good practice, but we'll swallow the exception. We won't actually want to exit out of this function. We want to gracefully complete the function in this particular case. And then the way to track it would be is just call telemetry track exception and give it the exception object itself. And that's pretty much it. Now let's make sure we actually call this function so it actually triggers the exception itself. So another thing you'll notice is this is actually complaining that it's an async method, but the response is actually not handled in an async way. So we'll go ahead and fix that. Let's go ahead and build it. And now we can go ahead and run it. So quite a bit of code or some of the changes, but once you get this set up and kind of understand the basics of this, it's going to be really useful for you to be able to actually see all the details that show up in the application insight. So let's go ahead and open it up and see what it shows us now. So as you can see, one of the servers actually disappeared, and we should now start seeing the dev machine come up. And no telemetry is coming through yet because we're not triggering the method yet. So let's go ahead and do that now. go back here, and we should start seeing the flow through of data. So you can see the exception rate just jumped by 1 after I actually relaunched the method. And let's go ahead and actually do that again a couple of times. And now you can see the data is actually flowing through. And one of the things that you see is you now can see the actual stack trace as well. So you can see that the say hello method was called, and then it called into throw exception, and it threw an application exception. Okay, and then another thing to see is you see the trace method itself, and we were basically outputting just this message called trigger method say hello. So this is pretty interesting information to see. But like I said before, there's actually more information that's actually coming through. So after a few moments, when you actually wait for the application insights to aggregate all the information and kind of analyze it for a little bit, you'll actually start seeing the operation name show up in here, as well as under the performance section. You can see that we're already beginning to see the telemetry. So a couple of things to notice here as well. So you can actually see the duration, the distribution of duration. You can see the request count and when it was happening. If you actually click on the actual method itself, you also see insights of those methods being called. So let's click on that and click on go to details, and then here you'll start seeing the details of the different requests that are coming through. So if you actually drill into it even further, you'll see a lot more detail, and this is where application insights really becomes really handy. So I can go ahead and click on show more, and you'll notice that it tells you what's the actual response code. You can see if it was successful, how much time it actually took, what's the actual URL that was being used, the request ID, performance, and many other pieces of information, including even sometimes the IP address. Now you can actually track this information, but be careful because some of the countries that the application users are using have different restrictions, so you want to make sure you're adherent to all of the local country laws. So you can also see other custom properties of the method, and you can actually add your own as well at a later point in time. So this becomes really handy for you as well. So we can also click on this view all telemetry, and you can see the sequencing of events as well. So this gives you a little bit more information and a slightly different view of the data. Now let's go ahead to application insights and actually see if we have any failures show up yet. And you can see right here, now we're beginning to actually show application exceptions as well. So you can see that they got triggered 7 times at this point. And then I can actually click on that and see the actual sequence of events here. So an exception got thrown when this say hello method got triggered, and then if you have different dependencies to SQL Server or different other layers of your application, you'll actually see that sequence of events here as well. So it's pretty powerful. And then let's go to this usage portion and click on users. And in here, you're also beginning to see the telemetry flow through in terms of who the user is or where they might be coming from. Now, this is getting into quite a bit more of an advanced topic, but you can start tracking things like performance, whether it was good or bad, depending on the response time. You can see, depending on where the users are coming from, how many sessions there were, how many different events were being executed. So if I click on events, you can start drilling more into the data. So, and in here, if you have a larger application, you'll basically start seeing that you have different methods and functions that are actually being executed right here. So this is a really nice way to navigate this information. Now, if you actually go back to your application insights and click on overview, another useful feature of this is you can click on this application dashboard and actually creates a dashboard for you, specifically for your application. Everything that's logged into appinsights will start showing some metrics right here. So this dashboard might be useful for you to monitor your application performance and different events that are occurring. And then from here, you can actually click on things and actually navigate to the different portions of application insight. So that is basically how easy it is to integrate your function app into application insights. And one last thing as a neat feature of Visual Studio, if you have it, is when you're running your code, if you click on this Application Insights button as well, you'll actually be able to point it through this data from a link to your Application Insights. And if you choose that instance that's running in your resource group, you'll actually be able to get even more detail right from your developer experience. So let's take a look at this. So right now I'm just showing the last 30 minutes, and I've chosen all of these different events, and it's actually bringing in all of this data from Application Insights. So let's go ahead and click on this particular trace, and on the right hand side from your Visual Studio you can actually see a lot of detail. Now you can actually click through some of these different links here to show you different information, and let's go ahead and click on all exceptions and see if it brings anything. So in this case, as we were actually logging exceptions, it actually showed me an exception. So let's go ahead and click here, and this is the really neat part for developers. So because it's an exception and it knows about the stack trace and I'm running the code itself on my machine, I can actually click on the particular method in the stack trace, and it takes me directly to the piece of code that actually triggered it. So this could be extremely helpful for your developers to be able to actually troubleshoot issues quickly as they're beginning to develop this application and gaining more insights. So hopefully this was useful. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those questions in the comment section below, and have a wonderful day.